Welcome to Mindful Reading to Write, Composing a Summary. In this video, we're going to extend a conversation from an earlier video that discussed mindful reading, where we looked at active and critical reading strategies. And this becomes the result of those strategies where we begin to compose and develop an effective summary for a text. As you get ready to engage in this video, just make sure you have whatever you need in order to take notes, jot down any questions or any points of discussion that you would like to have as you move forward when we begin to look at writing summaries in our course. The guiding questions for this particular video include: what is a summary? Where we want to look at how we define summary and look at it in ways of not only in the context of why it's important for us as writers to write effective summaries, but what summaries can do for us as effective readers and building the skills and strategies necessary to write an effective summary. And then we want to look at how we begin. So we're going to frame out the conventions of, or the genre of, writing a summary for a text. So let's first look at what a summary is. We may not think of it this way, but a summary is a natural consequence of our critical reading process, but it does take intentional practice. With that said, many times when we talk to each other, we will in essence summarize certain things that we have seen throughout our day, perhaps something that we saw on social media, or perhaps something that we saw in a video. And you summarize those points to somebody, let's say in a conversation. And at the same time, typically what we will do is always give our response to those points. What we want to do here is we want to separate out those two things. So for the purposes of this, we want to look at specifically just the summary portion of that conversation. So in a summary, the writers will first critically engage with the text through the integration of active reading strategies. And again, those are the strategies that we covered in an earlier video, or the video called Mindful Reading. Once we've done that, we capture the controlling idea or the central point and the supporting details, the overall main points of a text, in order to then develop them into a summary. So why is it important? Writing summaries require active and critical reading to the extent that you're able to provide the central point or thesis along with the evidence or support in your own words as the author intended. It's a good way to improve critical reading because it requires you to focus on understanding the whole of something rather just on small pieces and parts. So in essence, what you're doing is you're taking a text and you're kind of hovering over it at, let's say, 15,000 feet, and you're able to look at the central point, or remember from our mindful reading, the topic or subject, what the author is doing with that topic or subject, and then how they're supporting that central point that they're making about that topic or subject. So you're looking at those main points that they're using and kind of leaving those smaller details that are not really necessary for an effective summary. We're leaving those behind. Well, in order to do that, we've got to really understand what that central point or thesis or main argument of a text is. And while we think of summary as something that we do as part of our, let's say, academic, or in this sense, our college career, professionally, summary becomes extremely important as you look at having conversations with different projects in different professions that you're doing, that you would want to be able to summarize something for someone in order to move it forward. The ability to comprehend and discern information to others is something we do in our everyday lives. So let's look at summary as an everyday activity. Think about the last time you described a movie to someone. Now, when you described it, did you tell them every bit of dialogue from the movie, from beginning to end, where it was he said, she said, they said, we all said? Or did you just tell them the overall highlights and the important parts of that movie? Probably that second point. You probably went through the overall highlights and important parts of the movie. In essence, you summarized the movie for somebody. Because getting into the specific dialogue and into the weeds, whoever you're talking with is probably not going to be able to connect to the film as much as if you gave them the overall highlights or perhaps the themes that you saw throughout the movie. So let's take a look at an example. This particular one comes from Star Wars Episode 8, The Last Jedi, which happens to be one of my favorite film franchises. And this is an example of a summary of that entire movie. So it says Star Wars Episode 8, The Last Jedi is the second film in the Star Wars sequel trilogy and was released back in 2017. The film is focused on the Resistance, the good guys, and their fight against Kylo Ren and the First Order, the bad guys. The film follows the characters Rey as she receives Jedi training from Luke Skywalker while trying to convince him to return with her to help in their fight against the First Order. At the same time, the character Poe sends Finn, Rose, and BB-8 on a secret mission to find someone who can deactivate the First Order's tracking device that seeks to destroy any sign of the Resistance. The movie ends with an epic battle that includes a fight between Kylo Ren and Luke Skywalker. While this fight is taking place, Rey helps the remaining Resistance escape on the Falcon. Luke, exhausted from the fight, dies peacefully, becoming one with the Force. In the last scene, we see Rey and Leia sensing Luke's death and vowing that the Resistance can rise again. Now, this particular film is a little over 2 hours, if memory serves me. And this particular summary is one paragraph. And there are specific things included in this summary paragraph that we want to now dive into as we look at the genre of, or the conventions of, specifically a summary paragraph. So, let's define summary. A summary, in essence, as we define it, is a simplification of an author's text that's in your own words, clearly written to someone who hasn't read or seen the original material. And I say that because we want to imagine an audience who has not engaged with the text. Because if we assume that an audience has, we tend to then leave things out because then we assume that they would be able to connect the dots. So regardless of whether or not your audience has previously engaged with the same text, we want to write or imagine an audience who has not engaged with the text. It's shorter than the original version, and a more accurate way to say that is that it is concise, and that conciseness is what makes it shorter than the original version. Because as you noticed in that summary of Star Wars movie, I didn't go into dialogue. There were no direct quotes from the film. There were no specific scenes that were written into the summary. And that conciseness is what makes it shorter than the original version. A summary always includes the central point and the key supporting details. If we don't include the central point, if we haven't articulated that in our summary, then we haven't anchored it for our audience. The central point, or the main argument or assertion, is the anchor for your audience to be able to then connect with the key supporting details that you include in the summary. Your summary maintains a neutral or non-opinionated tone, and this is really important because a summary is not subjective, it's objective. You're reporting what something was done. So a summary is not where we're going to add our opinion. You're merely telling an audience what a text did. Typically, it's written in third person point of view, where we say the author states, or he says, or they say. The reason being is, while we read it in the past, we're summarizing it in the present. And that's where we look at maintaining that what's called literary present tense. Because we are not summarizing, for the most part, anything that we wrote, we would have no reason to use first person, because we're not interjecting our opinion. And because we're writing more of an academic text, we're not going to talk directly to our audience through that second person. So again, we're keeping it in that third person point of view because we're summarizing someone else's work. So let's think of a summary like this. It's complete, meaning that it's going to include all the ideas that are essential to the author's thesis or central point. It's concise, which means that it's considerably shorter and does not include non-essential information. It's accurate because it represents the author's ideas without distorting the author's views. It's objective because it's going to synthesize the author's points without including your objections or criticisms in the summary. You could do that later when we get to response or when we get to an analysis of the piece. It's coherent, meaning it should make sense to someone who has not read or seen the original. And remember, we want to imagine an audience who has not engaged with the text. It will allow us to better organize that coherent summary for our audience. It's independent. It's written in your own words. We're not going to pull direct quotes for the purposes of our summary, and there's a couple of reasons for this. If we can write this in our own words without changing what the author is intending as far as the communications, it means that we understand the text. If we can say something in our own words without distorting or changing the author's intents, it means that we ourselves are able to comprehend it. So when we think about critically engaging with a text or mindful reading, an effective summary is like a product of that process. So let's look at how we begin writing a summary paragraph. And I say summary paragraph as a mode or a means of practicing concise, effective summary writing, so that we don't extend or get into the weeds. So we use the paragraph as a way to just think concisely about being able to summarize a text. So first and foremost, writing a summary begins with reading. And again, we focused on the mindful reading process in an earlier video. But when we say it begins with reading, it means that you're critically reading and engaging with the content that you are going to summarize. In other words, you must first understand what you're summarizing. So to do this, you take notes on the source being summarized. Things like who's the title, who is the author, or who are the authors. What's the purpose of the text, the video, the article, or what you're summarizing? What is the author arguing or asserting? In other words, what's the author's central point? And then what evidence does the text or video or article, whatever piece you're summarizing, what evidence is included to support the central point? In other words, how does it support the central point or thesis? So when we're thinking about engaging in that reading process for the purposes of writing a summary, we need to understand the topic and subject, what the author is doing with that topic and subject, and then how that author supports that topic and subject. So once we have that, we need to think about how a summary paragraph begins to develop. So one thing to recognize is that the summary paragraph is a well-developed paragraph that includes the central point, along with the main evidence or support for that central point. And notice I say main evidence or support. And again, because we're not going to get into the weeds, we'll look at that example of Star Wars in just a second again. Typically, not always, but think of it for our purposes for right now, for the sake of just kind of practicing this, the first sentence of a summary, we're going to call that your summary sentence. Seems kind of silly to say, oh, I'm done, it's just one sentence. But in this context, a summary sentence is used to tell the audience very pertinent and direct information regarding the title of the piece, the author or the authors of the piece, and then the central point or argument of the article. It includes the title, author, a rhetorically accurate verb, and then the central point. The rhetorically accurate verb is the verb that ties that stuff together, and it best describes what the article is doing in its central point. It becomes super important to think about and look at what the rhetorically accurate verb should be. For example, if we take that chapter in the book of A Writer's Guide to Mindful Reading, it says in the book, A Writer's Guide to Mindful Reading, Ellen Carrillo demonstrates the importance of adopting active reading strategies in college reading and writing. Demonstrates is the rhetorically accurate verb because that is what the writer is doing in that text. They're demonstrating it. They're telling you what they are and why they're important. And in essence, they're demonstrating it. They're not comparing it to anything. They're not contrasting it to anything. They're demonstrating it. They're not simply discussing. They're not just simply stating. So we have to think about the verb that we use in that summary sentence because, again, it's the glue that holds it together and it brings the audience immediately into the piece. So as you can see, it tells you what it is in the book. It's a book. It's not a video, it's not a commercial, it's not a poster, it's a book. Then it has the title, A Writer's Guide to Mindful Reading. It has the author, and that's followed by the rhetorically accurate verb and the central point. So the verb, in essence, glues together what it is, the author, the title, and the central point. So that verb demonstrates is what most accurately describes what is happening in that book. So that's the first sentence of our paragraph. Clearly, that's not a whole paragraph. We're missing some things because the next question you should ask yourself is, how does the author do that? So now we have to look at the body of that summary paragraph, and that's going to include the key elements or evidence used to support the central point. So if we say that reading in that book demonstrates, right, the importance of critical reading strategies, then you say, well, how do they do that? That's where the key elements and evidence come into play. That's when you would bring forth those main points of evidence that the author uses to support that central point without getting into the weeds, as we say. So in my image, you see that one person's holding up the other. Think of the person kneeling as the support that's holding up that central point. So we have the demonstrating the critical reading strategies, or the importance of them, and the person holding him up is the support to how the author is doing that. The last piece of the puzzle to our summary paragraph is just the concluding sentence or a couple sentences that you might use. And to do that, you just use your own words and communicate the ending of the article. Think about a transitional phrase that might work here. In the end, the chapter does this. Or in the end, the author. Or in conclusion. Or the chapter ends, the book ends. You want to think about, how does the author conclude the text? and move the audience to that conclusion using some kind of signal phrase. So let's go back to our Star Wars example for just a second. If we were to dissect this through the three things that that summary paragraph should have, we've got a summary sentence that has the title, the authors, the central point, the rhetorically accurate verb. You've got the body of your paragraph, which provides the main points that support the central point. And then you've got some kind of concluding sentence in your own words that states how something has ended. So in using that particular lens for this, you see that in the pink, we have that summary sentence. Star Wars Episode 8, The Last Jedi, the second film in the Star Wars sequel trilogy, and was released back in 2017. The film is focused on the Resistance, the good guys, and their fight against Kylo Ren and the First Order, the bad guys. That's the central point. That's exactly what the film is doing. Good guys versus bad guys. That's it. We move into the blue section, or the body of our paragraph. This is going to walk us through just those main things that happened in the film. The film follows the character Rey as she receives Jedi training from Luke Skywalker while trying to convince him to return with her to help in the fight against the First Order. That's one of the major pieces of that film. At the same time, the character Poe sends Finn, Rose, and BB-8 on a secret mission to find someone who can deactivate the First Order's tracking device that seeks to destroy any sign of the Resistance. The movie ends with an epic battle that includes a fight between Kylo Ren and Luke Skywalker. While this fight is taking place, Rey helps the remaining Resistance escape in the Falcon. Luke, exhausted from the fight, dies peacefully, becoming one with the Force. Those are the major movements that happen throughout the film that support that good versus evil central point. And then finally, in the last scene, so here's the conclusion in yellow. In the last scene, we see Rey and Leia sensing Luke's death and vowing that the Resistance can rise again. So we've got this transition between the summary sentence into the main points without getting into the smaller details or in the weeds, as I say, and then moving into the last part or concluding sentence. So we can see how this one paragraph walked through each of those three things we talked about with regards to, say, the conventions or the genre of writing a summary paragraph, specifically a paragraph. So how does this work with the mindful reading? Let's take a look at that real quick. What does it mean to summarize a text? That's what we want to have in our mind. Well, it means that you've been able to identify and articulate the central point of a text. In so doing, you've assigned a rhetorically accurate verb to communicate what the author is doing with the topic of the text. For example, asserts or demonstrates, presents, explains, refutes, reiterate, develops, elaborate. Each of these verbs means something different. So when we say rhetorically accurate verb, you want to choose a verb that best describes what they're doing with the central point and with the subject of the text. It means that you've been able to extract the main points of a text. Those are the ones that are the most important points that support the central point. It means that you can do this in your own words without changing the message of the author. And that is super important to remember. Ultimately, it means that you understand the text, so you can more easily analyze, critique, synthesize, connect, and otherwise respond to a text. So why is this important? Well, in one of my favorite people, Dr. Seuss, the more that you read, the more things you will know. The more that you learn, the more places you will go. So as simply as that sounds, it's absolutely true. So when you think of a summary, we could think of our friend Dr. Seuss and his ever-present in our lives with regards to the impact of reading and writing. Thank you so much. Remember, you can always refer back to this video whenever you need to. and I wish you a wonderful day. Thank you.